Good afternoon, and welcome to the 5th Global Small Talk entitled Excellence in Design, Wild Contexts, where we invite you to engage in some inspiring discussion about architecture over lunch. I would like to introduce you to our three guest speakers, Iain MacLeod from the Bothy project, Gianni Botsford of Gianni Botsford Architects, and Piers Taylor of Invisible Studio. Today, our three speakers will each be sharing a presentation on their recent projects in unique, wild contexts. After the three presentations, I will be hosting a discussion and the Q&A with our speakers. Before I welcome our first speaker, I'd like to outline a few housekeeping tips to make sure that you have a good experience today. Please keep your microphones on mute, and please type your questions for the speakers in the Q&A box, and we will go through these as many as we can after the presentations. If you wish to, please indicate who you are and what company you work for, in case we need to get back to you after the event. If we don't get time to answer all the questions, we'll get back to you after the event in any case. So we're going to begin with Iain MacLeod. Iain runs his own practice based in Edinburgh and is co-founder of Bothy Project, a network of small-scale, off-grid art residency spaces in distinct and diverse locations around Scotland, where residents are able to use their time to explore creativity, landscape, and living simply. The Bothy project received an RSA award in 2011. Iain graduated from Edinburgh College of Art in 2006 and spent the next 15 years working for practices both in the UK and internationally. In 2019, he set up his own architecture practice, Studio IMA, focusing on design-led creative and residential sector projects in the UK. Iain is currently working on a range of products for Bothy stores, the commercial arm of Bothy Project, in response to the demand for multi-purpose small-scale structures that are suitable for a range of situations. He is talking to us today from his studio by Portobello Beach in Edinburgh, which you might just glimpse in the background of his screen, and you're certainly going to hear the wild weather that's howling around him. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Iain.
Hi there. So as Kate was saying, I thought for today's presentation I'd focus on my role with the Bothy project, as it's got its roots in delivering small-scale projects in pretty wild and rural settings, in particular in the Scottish Highlands. So the first slide here is the project started life as a collaboration between an artist friend of mine, Bobby Niven, and we received a successful grant application to the RSA. I think the original grant was only for about £5,000, which is a challenge to build any kind of scale of building for, I think. You'll agree. I think eventually it worked out at around £12,000, albeit with an army of volunteers. So as you'll see here, with a bit of youthful exuberance and more than a bit of naivety maybe, we started building our first Bothy in the car park at Edinburgh Sculpture Workshop with no end site agreed. So we had the idea being to shift it north as a residency space for visiting artists to encourage an escape out the central belt. So the immediate challenge for me as an architect was how to, going wholly against my training and practice ethos at the time, was how to design a building with no site in mind to react to. So decided from the outset to keep it as simple as possible, aim to create something that could be homogeneous to an entire region or country even, or evoke a character of an imagined context. So it was a fairly emotional response rather than any kind of analytical reaction to a predetermined site. So slide 2, this is, we were designing really to a conceptual idea of wildness and shelter, defaulting almost immediately to a very vernacular typology and form. We're also building ourselves on a very low budget, so it had to be achievable. There was a strong desire to create something that didn't attempt to compete too much with its surroundings or shout too loudly, but rather sit quite comfortably and confidently within it. Eventually, ESW gave us our marching orders from the car park, and we found, through a friend of a friend who happened to have an estate up north, this perfect pocket of ancient Caledonian forest to site of Bothy. So in my opinion, it's wholly appropriate visually, and it's going on to be host a really successful artist residency program up there. So fast forwarding 10 years or so, we decided to revisit the initial design we did for Intriac. This was really in response to people wanting to own one, essentially, and also to fund the residency side of the project. So in speaking to Kate before this event, we were just saying how much of the day-to-day architecture practice is essentially constant prototyping. You know, I think a lot of you will probably relate to constant stream of problems and details and new junctions and new technology to get your head around. So I find this project quite indulgent and luxurious in a way, in that, you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the one, you know, fairly simple vernacular form, and trying to distill it down to its most minimal, robust and necessary parts. So again, the design challenge for me was how to achieve a functional yet appealing aesthetic, whilst addressing a multitude of practical issues, such as whether it's delivered in one piece, or if not, how it's broken down, the ease and speed of construction in wild and remote environments, and then the kind of boring stuff like compliance with statutory regulations, permitted development, building control exemptions, maximum size for haulage and roads and things like that. So all these things duly considered, in my opinion, the end product takes on a fairly sort of chameleon characteristic, in that it does seem to be visually appropriate in a rural setting, but also it's, in my opinion, been quite successful in suburban and domestic settings as well. And you can see demonstrated here that it works well in a fairly kind of hard urban context. This is the new courtyard at Edinburgh Sculpture Workshops as it looks now. So this is the original prototype of the product coming through the Dromophila pass in a blizzard. So I would argue the materials can take on a fairly, you know, a different character in different settings depending where they are. For example, the corrugated Cor-10 cladding has been working quite well for us, as it seems to work in an industrial urban context, but also can bed down quite well into a kind of natural weathered, the natural weathered oxidized face of the Cor-10 kind of beds in quite well into a soft vegetative rural setting like a hillside of heather, for example. The internals, we kind of kept the same kind of treatment, so distilling them down to their most basic and minimal, and creating a space that's as flexible and durable as possible. Again, we don't know what the end use of some of these are, whether they're an artist studio or a holiday let. I think some people have tried to turn them into saunas potentially. So as a result, I think you get a sense of honesty and transparency in displaying the original, you know, the construction technique and materials. For example, the CLT panels you'll see on the left here, where the inside finished surface is the face of the structural panel. And likewise, on the right, we've exposed the internal structural timber frame and kept the envelope wholly external. Just some further details and finishes. So I thought I would try and take a quick look at some of the other projects we've delivered under the Bothy banner as well. So this is Pig Rock Bothy, where we actually had two known sites. So in a way, the opposite problem. The first site was next to the Charles Jenks landform in Modern One in Edinburgh, and then it was to eventually travel on to its permanent home in Assynt. To deal with the fact it's got two sites, we decided to celebrate the one constant, which was the exposed hardwood timber frame internally, and do two different external skin treatments relating to each site. So the first one was quite a skeletal, lightweight, opaque and kind of endearing skin for the gallery. And then in Assynt, I controversially proposed a more foreboding, austere black EPDM skin, which was conceptually supposed to echo the dark igneous gneiss rock that's prevalent in the area. We applied a kind of simple twist to the traditional pitched vernacular form by way of a 10-degree lean. It's really just intended as a humorous take on the perturbed features you see in wild, exposed locations. And I would also say it's a fairly classic form in its own right now, really, of basically a badly built shed in a kind of windy, exposed location. This is Sweeney's Bothy and Egg, where the end site was known from the initial design stage. The concept design here came about really from a mix of pretty careful analytical site analysis, because it's a culturally sensitive and SSI classification site, etc. But also a conceptual idea brought to us through a collaboration with the artist Alec Finlay. The single pitch follows the steep coastal topography leading up to some sea cliffs, but also houses an elevated bed of thorns for an ancient Norse warrior called Sweeney, which was part of the conceptual story behind it. The big windows to the front open up with a kind of spectacular view west over to the Isle of Rum. Yeah, so in looking through images for this event, this one really struck me, as it kind of clearly demonstrates that the context is king for these projects, really, and just how much effort and ingenuity is involved for each, you know, even the most modest of little buildings in this kind of location. So I also enjoy this image, as although it's quite dated now, this goes back to the Intuitive project. It still captures the spirit of what we're doing today, albeit we try and deliver our projects with a bit more of a streamlined build process. We use better lightweight structural technology, well-considered logistics, bit of health and safety, things like that. So we're constantly learning new techniques, adapting to new rules, testing new materials all the time. So, you know, just to wrap up, I would argue that although, you know, a lot of these bothies are not always designed for individual locations, through the experience of building them as a type, a sense of wildness gets fed back into the overall design through any lessons that we've learned from previous projects. So the master product at any one time has every other build that's gone on that we've done for the project ingrained in it, essentially. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iain. Fantastic. Yeah. What an amazing image that last image is.
Yeah.
To encapsulate the theme for today. So now we're going to move on to Gianni. Gianni Botsford was born in Venice and founded London-based practice Gianni Botsford Architects in 1996. He studied at Kingston University and the Architectural Association in Professor John Fraser's Evolutionary Architecture Unit. He has taught at both the Architectural Association and London Metropolitan University. Gianni currently teaches a unit with me at the Welsh School of Architecture, which was inspired by our work as founding members of Studio in the Woods, an annual design and make workshop where students test ideas through making at one-to-one alongside practicing architects, founded by Piers Taylor, so you'll hear more about that later. Gianni's research work at the AA and subsequently with Arup into the optimization and control of natural light has been used throughout the projects his studio has built and developed to integrate into the concept of local adaptation. The first of these built projects was Lighthouse, which won an RIBA award and an AIA UK award in 2006. He was also the recipient of the Architectural Record Design Vanguard, which is given for a body of work. Today he's going to talk about his project Casa Kike, which received the RIBA Lubetkin's Prize for the best new building outside the European Union in 2008. So over to you, Gianni.
Thanks, Kate. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm going to talk about a project in Costa Rica we built but started work on it between 2005 and finished in 2007. And it was interesting opposition to work we'd done on the projects in the UK. It was a very, very different context. Costa Rica sits between Colombia to the north and Panama to the south in Central America, and is a very kind of rich natural environment. Our project was on the coast of Cavite, on the Caribbean coast, and the house Casa Quique sits just on the outskirts of the city, that small town. The topography in Costa Rica is very varied, but sits around mountains and volcanoes along a central spine. And Costa Rica itself has an amazing number of national parks, so it's a very early pioneer in protecting the use of the environment and protecting the environment by setting these up, I think, in the 50s. So there are over 22, one of which is in Cavite itself along the coast. Amazing amount of natural rainfall, up to 6 meters in some areas. Where our site is, there's between 2 and 3 meters, which is roughly 3 times the UK's rainfall. And consistently kind of warm temperatures, so it's a tropical and subtropical environment, between 24 and 28 degrees average in Cavite. And then using natural winds are very important for us. So there's a kind of slow movement of wind from the sea, from the Caribbean coast. So our site is on the kind of outskirts of this small town, which is really kind of touristy enclave, and some fishing and some kind of growing of plant, bananas and coffee in the region. We're surrounded by a kind of cluster of other houses, all facing the sea. There's a beach right next to it. We had an existing house. So this town is quite a sleepy, I think, population of 2,000 place with lots of a certain amount of tourism within it. And our site is right on this black sand beach, volcanic beach, which is quite wild, and facing the other way connects to the coral and the national park of Cavite National Park. And our site is dissected by this small lane that sits between it and the sea, and our view of the sea itself. So our site was, it has an existing house on it and a number of very, very tall trees that were very important to the project and very attractive to the client. And one rule we had to work with is that no trees were to be cut down. And looking around the kind of context that we were working within, I was intrigued by the experience of being in these houses. So this was a neighbour's house where he'd sit in the chair in the window, smoking a cigarette, looking out to the view. And at the end of the day, he'd close these windows, but it took me some time to realize that the windows didn't have any glass in, didn't have any mesh in, but they were a kind of psychological barrier to the outside. But essentially, you live outdoors and all you do is protect yourself from the sun and from the rain. So those are the kind of two primary drivers of any project. What I was really interested in as well is the way that these buildings are put together in quite an ad hoc, simple way, using very local, cheap materials. So obviously timber's abundant there, very carefully controlled, and corrugated iron is the cheapest roofing material. So our initial analysis, we were hoping that the canopy of trees would protect our site from the sun sufficiently that we wouldn't have to worry about it too much, because you do feel the canopy's presence very much when you're in Costa Rica. But we realized we had to develop a way of protecting the building from the sun and the rain, but also allowing these views that we had, expansive views to the sea and back to the jungle. And through this process of working out where the optimal site would be and an optimal form, we found we needed a space of 100 square meters approximately for this main studio in between the trees. And we realized that by rotating this form to a twisted parallelogram, we'd overcome a number of issues at once. We'd have a roof that would fully protect the low sun as it rose and then came over the house, and then as it set in the afternoon, from the glazing that faces the sea and faces the jungle. And at the same time, this shift gave us some other ways of overcoming privacy from neighbours and controls of views. So a number of iterations of this form emerged, and looking at how the timber structure might work. And this is the kind of early model of that kind of solution, which is this twisted parallelogram form with a roof carrying out the protection on the three sides. So in section we ended up with two raised pavilions. They're raised up off the ground to protect from termites and other animals, but also to promote the breeze from the sea, which is very important for the kind of natural cooling process we were looking for. And the two pavilions are separated in such a way that they're out of each other's wind shadow. So the main pavilion facing the sea is the study, and the rear pavilion faces the jungle and is a bedroom. And in between them is an external walkway that became a kind of very important social space between the two. Now, it's built entirely of local materials for a number of reasons, but the primary one was that there are no other available materials in Costa Rica at the time. It was a very, very limited palette one could work with, but also very enjoyable to work with the knowledge they had of the various timbers that you could use. So this is a ironwood called kasha, which is extremely heavy and dense and was used for the piles. And then laurel is used for the main structure above ground. Although we had to source it specifically for our project because we had lengths of up to 10 meters in our building. We tried to communicate remotely with drawings, but found that very difficult. Eventually, I went over to Costa Rica with models of the house and essentially had to explain to the contractors, we want this model built exactly like this, but a lot bigger over there. And that was the process we went through. So with these models in their hands, and also crucially, the junctions of every single different junction within that building, we were able to explain what they had to do. And suddenly there was this kind of very nice way of overcoming the complexities of the project just with a very straightforward way of communicating, which is through physical models that we always like to do anyway. And there are junctions up to 8-way junctions, so you realize how important they are, but not only that they're important, that we'd solved them three-dimensionally for them before they started work. So the site we located between the trees, and we dug the piles into the ground about 1 meter, and there's a small concrete pad footing. Then the platform is built up off the ground, about 1 meter off the ground. And then the superstructure emerges from that. What I really like about this image is that this is kind of 4 or 5 months into the build. And you can see on the ground there's almost no damage at all because there's no tools, there's no big plant, there's no cranes, there's no scaffolding. It's built kind of piece by piece in a very slow, calm way, and nature isn't damaged at all. So the structure is then clad in timber, and then after the timber it's clad in waterproofing and insulation, and then corrugated iron. The finished house sits between the trees, and when I first came to visit it after it finished, I actually walked straight past the house because I didn't notice it. It just kind of disappeared tonally and formally within this context, which I think is really interesting. And it's very finely tuned to this context. The 10-degree pitch of the roof is from the material itself. And the angles of the two, the front and the back, are to do very specifically with protecting the glazing from the sun. This is the connected walkway you can see between the main studio and the bedroom. And the brief was a studio for a writer, actually my father, and he had 16,000 books and a grand piano. And the kind of scale of the project actually emerged through housing that many books as much as anything else, as did the height of the space itself, which is up to 4.5 meters on the seaside. And then when you look in the other direction, it's very transparent. So we fully glazed the two elevations, which are 10 meters wide, with a louvered glass, which is a local material that can slide open, and you can also rotate to control the air movement to keep the house cool. There's my father at work in the studio. And this is one of his favorite places, which is a kind of to the rear of the studio, facing back. So it's more private, very kind of protected from the sun and the rain. And the rear building, which is the main bedroom, which has a very different atmosphere internally and faces the jungle. So you have this kind of amazing time in the early evening when you're looking at the jungle and the animals emerging. You see them there in context now, and how they've kind of had to sit very closely to existing trees, and the house sitting between the trees again at dusk. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianni. Lovely. So our third speaker today is Piers Taylor. Piers is an architect and principal of Invisible Studio. He founded the now cult Studio in the Woods, which both Gianni and I are members of. With Martin Self, he founded the Architectural Association's graduate programme, AA Design and Make, where students spend 16 months designing and constructing buildings at the AA's Hook Park campus. Piers is also a PhD candidate at the University of Reading and received their anniversary scholarship funding for his doctoral research into making in an architectural context. Piers studied originally in Australia with Pritzker Prize winner Glenn Murcutt. He has designed a large number of seminal buildings and is the recipient of numerous awards for his work, which have been published widely and internationally. Invisible Studio have recently won a 2017 National RIBA Award for their Tree Management Centre at Westonbirt Arboretum, a project that also won 3 regional RIBA awards. He lives in a prototypical self-built house that won the AJ Small Projects Award, and he manages a 100-acre woodland as a research resource for his practice, and also the original home of Studio in the Woods. Piers sits on the Southwest Design Review panel and is a regular contributor to a number of articles of architectural journals, including the Architectural Review, the Architects Journal. Piers is also one of the leading architectural broadcasters for the BBC. He has held a number of academic positions, including Unit Master at the Architectural Association and the University of Cambridge, and has delivered numerous lectures nationally and internationally. His work has been published in multiple journals and featured in a number of independent documentaries. So now over to you, Piers.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, great, fantastic. I'm going to talk about the woodland that we live and work in and the opportunities that that gives us to think about things differently. And I suppose I think of the woodland that we live and work in as a kind of sketchbook to explore ideas alongside the buildings that we deliver as part of practice that are then infused by those ideas that emerge from the sketches that we do in the woodland. So in a way also, I suppose this talk is how not to be an architect, because what I discovered over 20 years of living and working here is that I was trying to unlearn ways of doing things that I would do typically in practice or had been taught in architecture school. As Kate mentioned, I studied in Australia historically. My mother was Australian, so I have dual nationality. I mean, in a way, I'm not really from anywhere. But Glenn was, in some ways, a big influence because his mode of practice was extraordinary. He still designs and draws and documents everything by himself. He has no staff from his front room. And, you know, it's a cliche in some ways, that this sense of touching the ground lightly. But Glenn was the first person that really made me understand what it was to work in a context where you really could put a building down incredibly delicately and just not touch the landscape in which it sat. And in a British context, that's a very unusual thing because, you know, we have no wilderness to a certain degree. But as I sort of implied, our architectural education gears us to be sort of little proto Howard Rorke's that Ayn Rand wrote about, and to deliver buildings that are kind of uber controlled and are super kind of logical. And in a way, one of the advantages of working or doing self-initiated projects is that you can do things differently. And in a way also, I'm interested to talk about this notion of wildness, which isn't just this idea of landscape. It's really this reading here, which allows us to really explore completely alternative ways of doing things. So I now, for the moment, partially live and work partially in the United Kingdom and This is my favourite image of the United Kingdom when it was connected to France, rather than cut adrift, a little Brexity island sitting, abandoned in a piece of North Sea. And this, of course, is Doggerland as it was up until 20,000 years ago. And I live and work in the southwest, where there are 5 water-worn valleys that come into Bath, and our valley is just north of Bath, about 3 miles as the crow flies north of Bath. And our land goes from the very top, where my cursor is, where it's green, the very top, right the way down to the bottom. So it's kind of valley top, valley side, valley bottom, which is sort of interesting. This is standing at Little Salisbury Hill, looking across the valley to the trees on the horizon. Those trees that are on the horizon then drop down behind the first hillside are where we live and work. And this is then looking back towards Bath. And as you can see from this landscape, this piece of landscape is an ancient piece of landscape, but it's been worked for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So I look across to Little Salisbury Hill on the left-hand side. All these field patterns are ancient. I look across to an Elizabethan manor house that's, ancient house that's evolved over many years. So this landscape is highly cultivated. These woodlands that we live and work in aren't a piece of wilderness. They're a piece of planted landscape. They were planted largely after the war, when we needed pit props and furniture. Of course, we don't need pit props, and most people go to IKEA. So this is looking at the house. My studio is buried in the trees on the left-hand side, and those trees then drop down and go round the corners. So some of them are north-facing, mixed woodland. And this is, in a sense, in a large part, how we work here, in a very kind of informal manner, with just people who live and work around here. But the buildings that I was influenced by weren't things like the Barcelona Pavilion. They were these incredibly ordinary buildings that farmers design and deliver here, just with the most basic understanding of where the weather comes in from. So the building on the left knows that the weather comes in from the west, so it turns its back on it. The building on the other side has a very simple mechanism of allowing the grain to be stored up to the top of the concrete, and then air to come across the top of it and keep the rain out. Very, very simple, but super effective. And you see these all around the world. And these buildings, in a way, weren't buildings that my tutors at architecture school ever really showed me. But we came here 20 years ago when we just bought a little slice of woodland. We had the first half acre with an old, kind of absurd old castellated building on it that was falling down because it didn't understand how to sit in the shadow on highly shrinkable clay next to this big ash tree. We had one child, and we then had another, and another was conceived, and we knew we needed to get on and extend this house. But the importance of this slide is to really show that everything that we consumed, everything that we produced, had to be carried initially down this 500-metre long path, because originally 20 years ago we had no car access to the building that we bought, and that in a way made us aware of the kind of weight of our own consumption. The house, in a way, the first building, was a kind of reductive sub-Mercutian, simple, lightweight pavilion that opened up and sat in the shadow of this big ash tree and touched the ground lightly. And it was the beginning of a realization that if I was going to do things for myself, I needed to do things differently. I needed to deliver things differently. And as I looked around again, and I realized that the buildings that people did without architects that were around here were much more interesting than the buildings that architects like me did. And these kind of relationships, an architect couldn't have done something like that. Why is it that we can't do things like this? And yet these buildings have a kind of inscrutability that is a kind of endlessly fascinating. Of course, I'm super interested in these photographs of ordinary buildings and these compositions of windows, again, that architects could almost never do buildings like this. And in my local city, which is Bath, when I look at the changes that architects have made to the buildings that architects designed, they're invariably more interesting than the moves that the architects made. So the rear of the terraces are more interesting than the front of the terraces, and so on. So as Kate mentioned, I worked on the Design and Make programme, and what was really fascinating about the Design and Make programme was how ordinary our moves were. And we designed buildings, we detailed them, and we delivered them with contractors in a kind of super straightforward manner. And I kind of began to really question what I was doing in a context like that, where, as Sophie from Bureau Happel once said, you think you're so radical, but actually, where are the non-architects working with you? Why are you just being an architect? And of course, we mistake radical making for radical thinking. So this woodland that we're in now has informed much of how I began to kind of steer a path away from that. And this programme in particular that Kate and Gianni talked about Studio in the Woods has been super influential for me, particularly. And this is Studio in the Woods here 3 years ago in a ordinary building that my neighbour built. Kate has this interesting question, why is this building not architecture, and yet some of the other buildings that sit in the woodland are? I don't really know the answer to that question, but maybe we can talk about it afterwards. But the programme that Kate mentioned again, Studio in the Woods, has allowed us to explore designing and making as a reciprocal act with architects and non-architects, skilled people, unskilled people, all as this kind of seamless and interwoven path of decision making. So when I look at a building like this, it isn't a kind of random crazy collection of sticks. It's a kind of super logical exploration of an idea about how something could be made, and then it's a kind of map of the embodied act of lifting things into place, which is then kind of frozen in time. The building that I'm in now is the first proper building that we did in some ways in the woodland that set out to do things differently. It just took the trees that stood on the site that this building is on, and it used a 2-day milling process to do the least amount of milling for the least amount of money to get one good face on the timbers that needed to meet another timber. The drawings that we began to do were these kind of drawings where everything could go on one blackboard, and it was the result of one conversation. Every detail is on this drawing. There are no dimensions because the dimensions are given by the pieces, the embodied length of the materials that then used and laid up on top of one another as a kind of template for the next one. So nothing is measured. The building's set out on site and built then with a digger. Diggers are super cheap. If you get them over Christmas, you can get them for 2 days, pay for 2 days, you get them for 2 weeks. My neighbour's brother is a digger driver. So this is the building when it's finished, and of course it's only partially finished because that's all the material we had. We didn't go shopping for any more material, so we had to work out a way to kind of waterproof the building because we only had that amount of cladding. The windows were scavenged, and internally the arrangement of the studs was a highly sort of eccentric journey by the people that made this building. They had no idea how to make a building, so they put studs where they thought they should go, not where I thought they should go. And I think that's kind of super interesting. So I'm left with a kind of map of their learning. The desks were on the floor with the scaffolding, and all of these arrangements sort of interest me when I look at the arrangements of studs and so on. I couldn't have predetermined most of these things. They were invented in an ad hoc way by the people learning and making these things. All the marks are left on the timber, all the mud, everything is a kind of journey and a description of how this building came into being. And I've just 3 more little buildings that we've done since then in a similar vein. The next building was a kind of zero waste building that we just used the waste material that we had around, zero waste, zero cost, to make a tiny little outhouse for the studio. This is at this time of year when the wild garlic is at its height. We built that again with a digger and my neighbours, who didn't ever sense that they were making anything. They were doing making in a way that the AA might call this kind of rarefied activity, kind of making. We didn't invent any details beforehand. We just made this thing, plonked it on the site, and now this is our bathroom. And it's kind of trying to really not be willfully ad hoc, just make something in a very direct manner where you explore and negotiate with the contingencies of what I call kind of real sort of engagement, rather than trying to idealize a set of arrangements before you make them. And again, what it also allows me to explore is that process of drawing, which in this case we did after the building, and finally, in this case, made a model. So it's a kind of weird reverse process. So I'm interested again in this idea of the material as a sort of, a sort of generator of an idea. And I was highly influenced by Carl Andre's Equivalent 8 that he did in the Tate 30 odd years ago. And someone wrote that fantastic book, which was, is this art or is it bunk? Is it about the arrangement of fire bricks in a pile that made it interesting? Is it the material? What is it about this material, that this thing that's interesting? And he just used the same material. So we had a glut of timber one year. I got it all milled into 5x2 because I thought I could build anything out of 5x2. And this was then the first equivalent building that we did, just used everything out of 5x2. And that was the only thing that we knew we could do, just use this. So when things were long, we had to make trusses. When they were thick, we had to laminate them up. We then carried it down with a digger and made it into a little kind of prototyping barn. You can see my neighbour's skills getting better. And this is then just sort of clad again in stuff that comes from our local fabricators. Equivalent 2 was then a little house that we made for my daughter. That's a kind of relocatable building that sits just down here. And that was again, same 5x2, made in the barn, laid up as a template, the next one going on top of that, and then taken down on the trailer, which became the base of this, well, it is called Trailer, in fact, the project. And then my neighbours, again, no sense they were kind of making anything in a formal way. They were just doing what, you know, rural, resourceful people do without overthinking it. And then finally, what's kind of interesting is the house that I talked about 10 years ago, which was this sort of incredibly formulaic, you know, Mercatian, sort of quasi-modernist sort of, you know, self-conscious building. We've now revisited and stripped away some of those kind of, you know, slightly naive, bad A-level essay type moves, and kind of reverted it to a kind of more ordinary sense of building, which is free now to adapt and move. And as we've been living here now in the last year, I've carried on kind of making changes to the house again. So the last thing that we've done, you know, as of a few weeks ago, is just put a new canopy up outside the back door as a kind of first mark of doing something new again, having stripped away the original house completely and with it sort of killed off my youth. I'm going to finish just on the point of these projects is not that they're projects that are interesting in their own right. They're all kind of quite badly made sketches, but the idea of these buildings is that they all inform the other much bigger projects that we do as part of practice. Thanks.
Thank you, Piers. Fantastic. Well, thank you, all three of you, Iain, Gianni and Piers, for your brilliant presentations. We're now going to move on to the discussions and the Q&A. So can I encourage people to put any questions they want into the Q&A? I was going to kick off before going into the questions appearing in the chat with an observation about the three projects that I think is one reason it's very interesting to hear about them all together. And it's about their connection to the wild context, which is very specific in each case, but incredibly different. And so I suppose with, if I start with Kazakike, that's a project which Gianni developed an understanding of a place from a distance. I mean, I know that he had an opportunity to visit the site a few times, but I don't think he'd ever been to Costa Rica before. And a lot of his understanding of the place came from a kind of observation that was made through analysis remotely using digital tools, sunlight analysis, collecting data like some of the stuff that you showed us, Gianni, as well as acquiring knowledge, kind of vernacular knowledge through talking to people locally. But there's this kind of way of understanding a place by collecting information about it from a distance. And Piers, I think your project is about a kind of 24/7 immersion in a place, and about how what began as, I think, to use your words, as rubbing a few sticks together in the woods with Studio in the Woods, has actually ended up in a kind of, I think, an incredibly serious approach to architecture that now feeds into all of your architectural projects and informs the way you think about architecture, and has led to you doing a PhD, which I think you're about to complete, or maybe you have completed now. And Iain's projects, which are the Bothy projects, are, I mean, they're a prefabricated solution to a way of engaging with a wild context, which has got an incredible heritage, I think, a kind of literary heritage, actually, where the hut has been the kind of means by which people have been able to engage with nature or to live in kind of incredibly harsh conditions. They've been a way of sort of enabling humans to kind of survive in very remote places. And two books that immediately spring to mind are Henry Thoreau's Walden, which is about a kind of engagement with nature that is experienced through living in a hut by a lake. And he talks about the kind of air coming through the cracks in the walls, which are very kind of important experience about sort of removing oneself from comfortable existence in a city. But also a book that I read recently is Christine Ritter's book, A Woman in the Polar Night, which is about her experience of living in the Arctic Circle for over a winter, for a whole year, in fact, in a 10-foot by 10-foot shed. which again has got this kind of, I don't think there's any sort of indigenous connection to the vernacular has come from our kind of Western tradition. But your image of a shed being transported on a lorry off to a place in the wilderness kind of evokes that pioneering spirit and the idea of inhabiting wilderness. So I don't know if any of the three of you would like to comment on how context, how you, I suppose a kind of general comment of whether or not you think it's important that architecture somehow represents the place that it's in, whether or not you think as a kind of, do you take a position as an architect as to whether or not a piece of architecture should to sort of somehow visually be influenced by the place that it's in, or be representative of that in some way. Would anyone like to volunteer first to answer that question? Gianni, you're sticking your hand up.
Oh yeah, so I mean, for me it's fundamental, but I don't think it's something representative of necessarily, in my case, what's around it. But when I look back at a project that's been successful we've done, I think it represents everything we've understood about the place and could only have been like that in that specific context. It couldn't have happened anywhere else. I remember when we finished Kazakike, we got emails from people saying, can you send me the plans because I want to build one where I am in Wyoming or something. And for me, it just made no sense whatsoever to send them the plans or for them to build that house somewhere else, because there would be no reason for it to be like the way it was. So I think that's our approach to that kind of contextual issue.
I think one of the first questions that I always ask my students, and I think I've asked your students too when I've come, is, you know, what is the territory of a project? And I think it's a really complicated thing to define where a project is. And I think, you know, I love the way that Tim Ingle describes territory, which is, you know, our lives are a kind of tangle of lines that mesh, but there are always these straggly bits that come out of it. And I think those straggly bits, in some ways, when we look at a specific context, are the cultural baggage we bring to it, the kind of ad hoc things that we can't predict that get woven into the project. And I don't think there is a simple binary reading of how a building should and could respond to a particular place, but I kind of think it's inevitable that it does, but despite us and because of us, if you know what I mean. And I always think that, you know, it's kind of super interesting, you know, when we look at a town, that town doesn't exist, you know, it's a piece of kind of territory that has grey edges. I remember coming and looking at your students' work in, you know, Morocco. And, you know, if they were interested in the wetness, their territory was something completely different than somebody that was interested in the built environment of one town that was made out of sand from the desert. So I think all of our work is influenced by where it is, but where it is a kind of complex set of nuanced pieces of understanding and being informed by this idea of kind of territory that is a kind of shifting and slightly fleeting target.
Iain, do you want to come in on that? When we spoke on the phone, you were talking, I think, about how there was a sort of conflict for you in some ways between the Bothy project and your approach in your rest of your architectural work, but that there were specific elements that you were trying to introduce into the Bothy that would make it place specific, like where the window enabling the view.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a very uncomfortable place for me, not knowing the site, and you do have a degree of control that's removed, and perversely, I quite enjoy that loss of control. Like, you know, so, you know, like I was saying, I think that, you know, a lot of the decisions you make in a design of something for a prototype of a product like this is influenced by imagination, where you imagine the products ending up and what kind of context you think would be suitable. But then ultimately, you don't have control over where they end up if you're going to market it as a product. So you're trying to, that's the idea of kind of trying to pare it down to its most basic parts and components and almost make it as chameleon-like or homogeneous as possible to a ranging degree of context, which it's not a natural place or a comfortable place for me, but I don't mind that. But, you know, in terms of when I was talking about the fenestration or the window placement on the products that we're designing, Obviously, you don't, you know, typically you would look at where you put a window in relation to a view or the orientation or the sun path or whatever, but obviously we don't know that in each case here. So we took the decision to go for a kind of tall, full height window, quite narrow, and offer a kind of cross-sectional view of, you know, whatever context it's in, basically, and also crucially a window on each side so that the orientation doesn't really matter. And it also echoes the, you know, the original, the kind of historic idea of a bothy or a shieling or something is basically to keep the weather out and the views out. You know, it's very small pinhole windows and very thick walls. So we're trying to kind of echo that in a way. But yeah, like Piers is saying, I don't think there's any formulaic way to design any building. But I quite personally, you know, in my own private practice, I always respond to the site and do a fairly analytical environmental analysis of the site as a starting point, just by, you know, that's my training and that's my instinct. So it is, I do find it quite uncomfortable not knowing the site, but then I just try and enjoy that loss of control as much as possible.
We have some questions coming in now, so I'm going to there are a couple of themes emerging, and there are some about process. So I thought I would start with Ben's question, who is he's making the comment that Gianni has used wonderful physical models to communicate the design and construction of the building. He's asking, how important do you think it is to use physical modelling in the design process in an industry that seems so concerned with digital design? So Gianni, if you'd like to answer that, but the others can come in after they have thoughts on that.
I mean, for us, it's fundamental. We always make models, even if we're working consistently in digital ways. Now, I mean, during this remote work process, it's been much harder because my people working in the studio are working remotely and less able to make models. So I've tended to make some of them myself and look at them because I find I kind of have to understand the context and the forms in that way that's very specific. So I don't want to only work in one method of just physical models or just digital, and I think for us the merging of the two is really important.
Do either of Piers, do you want to come in on that? I know you're a big model maker.
Yeah, we do. I mean, again, we make models of everything that we build in practice, invariably, and of course digital models. But I think, you know, the buildings that I described as part of this talk, I think of them as models, and I'm weirdly nervous of this sense of you know, the model is prototype, where something gets prototyped and prototyped and prototyped and refined, and in a way things get lost. And what I love is the immediacy of that first messy sketch model where you explore an idea, and the exploration, the use of a model to explore an idea is something that I'm really sort of interested in. And you know, the buildings in a way that I've talked about are models that explore an idea. They're badly made, they're imperfect, but they are quick sketches, quick sketch models that allow me to kind of understand something, rather than, you know, a series of models as prototypes is a kind of different thing. And that is something that we still do in practice. But I think, so models have multiple purposes, and you know, and they're super useful. And I would say for us, they're essential. For other people, they may not be, but I find drawing really important too. But again, for other people, you know, some people don't draw, which I think is also kind of interesting, you know. So people have all sorts of processes, but for us, models of all sorts are super important.
Iain talked about prototyping, I think, at the in your talk, and actually, in a way, they're big models, aren't they? I mean, building stuff at 1-to-1. I mean, Iain, you're prototyping something to prefabricate and
definitely. I mean, I suppose the benefit of projects of this scale is that you can prototype at 1-to-1. You know, obviously, you know, if you're doing a £10 million office block, you're not going to be prototyping that at 1-to-1. But you know, you can do well, as both Piers and Gianni were saying, you can do kind of one-to-one detail injunctions and test them, and then you know, in this case, the Bothy that we saw coming through the Dromota Pass on the lorry, that was the original prototype to be displayed in a location in Edinburgh, but then it was to go on to its permanent home in Balcaskie Estate and Fife beyond that. So it was the idea of we managed to prototype it, but with an end purchaser, an end client in mind, which is that's the ideal, I guess.
I think this relates also to a question from David John, who's asking about how the effect of building these micro projects or smaller scale projects and doing them yourselves, I suppose, how that has influenced your kind of design practice generally. And yeah, I mean, well, I'll just read the question that do you find that you have a better understanding of physical design than you would if you'd just done 3D modelling drawings of the buildings? And do you think that mainstream architecture practice is heading towards, I'm not quite sure if it means heading towards more 3D modelling or more sort of actual making, but what are your thoughts on that? Gianni, do you want to?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're all facing this challenge as architects of expectations of buildings being produced from the computer. The number of times I've had a client saying, can you just send me an image of the building before we've even designed it, is kind of extraordinary. And, you know, there's a process of exploration you have to go through before you can come up with a design, and modeling it and understanding it is the first step, and then it will slowly evolve through that process.
I was just going to jump in and say, you know, one of the reasons I was originally interested in pairing up with my friend and doing the Bothy project it was almost a reaction to having, you know, worked in a, you know, quite large scale commercial practice in London, and I moved back up, and I was fairly desperate to get some hands-on experience with actual materials and do some actual building in locations. So without doubt, you know, actually handling materials and building it yourself, and, you know, just getting a malleable relationship, what you're building influences what, you know, feeds back into everyday practice, definitely.
I mean, I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think, you know, the buildings here are partly a product of being greedy to build, hungry to build, and, you know, it takes so long to build in architecture. You know, some projects are 5 years long, and we work on something for 5 years, and, you know, and the last 2 years is that getting built. And, you know, I think all of us are probably hungry to build, and some of the explorations here have just been to sort of sate that desire to make something that is full scale. But I also think the model that I am really interested in is that was the focus of my PhD, was a model that Kate and Gianni and their students made at Studio in the Woods, where, you know, that model was collectively made. It's a full-size model. It's a prototype. It's a piece. It's a building that, you know, you can in theory get in or stand next to or under, and, you know, you didn't know the shape and scale of that building or the component relationships before you, at any stage of the product, you didn't know what it was going to be, you know, and the process of making and your way of looking at things and analyzing, you know, constructed analysis allowed you to discover a set of relationships through making that model. And I think that's kind of super interesting. So models at that extreme are just so exciting because they allow us to understand something that we couldn't otherwise see or, you know, or visualize. They're very different from the models that we do still make in practice, which, you know, we might even laser cut a model so we know what shape it is. But even that sort of model will tell us something new, I think.
This may be connected, but I have a question here, which is, what would each speaker think? What one thing would each speaker change in general in architectural education? I don't know if there's a connection here, but who would like to kick off with the answer to that?
I would say a common theme is more hands-on experience in actual building and doing like we're saying, one-to-one prototypes, and it sounds like you guys are on top of that, but certainly during my education I didn't get any of that, so.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think of buildings as highly collaborative things that we make with groups of people, and that doesn't mean we're not, you know, designers or even a lead designer, but I think the difference of, you know, university and compared to practice is that, you know, there are multiple things that inform, multiple people that inform the making of a building. And I think at university, I think it's a negative thing in some ways that those voices don't, as a student, you can't kind of synthesize those voices and be challenged by those voices and know when to incorporate something or not incorporate something. It's a very solitary act, designing something at university, that I suppose I feel is a loss, and something I enjoy is constantly those ongoing conversations with people who may be the people that are making it, or they may be co-designing it, but there's always other people involved in that process in practice.
I mean, I think our aim in teaching is to have the students come out with a way of thinking about how to design and a process that they can follow, and above all to be kind of open-minded and to kind of really look carefully at the context they're working in. So I think that's the kind of main focus of what we do.
We've gone 1 minute over time, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to close the event now. We can maybe respond to some other questions via email. So I'd just like to finish by thanking our three speakers hugely for your talks today. They were fantastic. And thank you, audience, for engaging with the discussion and the Q&A. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Kate.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.